Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Jane, for the introduction. Thank you, Professor O'Prey, for having me here on and off during the present and possibly also the coming year. I feel very much as someone who has crossed borders. I'm a North London boy. And obviously growing up in North London, I did occasionally cross the border called the River Thames. But until earlier on this year, I realized I'd never actually slept a night south of the river. And when I came in March for the first time and I used an accommodation, a flat here on campus, I called Elaine, my wife, also an ex-Londoner, an East Londoner, and I said, Elaine, there's a funny feeling, I've crossed the border, I've slept across the border, as though I hadn't traveled anywhere else in the world before, and I've come through it quite unscathed. And I think that's an important theme that I'll want to pick up during the evening about what happens when people cross borders, not just the borders between states, although the three of us as scholars of geopolitics coming from geography and dealing with political science probably focus mostly on the territorial dimensions and on the borders of states and the extent to which they exist or don't exist, the extent to which they have or have not disappeared over the past 20 years. But I would like to posit this evening that to understand borders, we need to understand not just the physical constructs or the lines or the fences or the walls, but we need to understand the dynamic social processes of what we call bordering. How do borders come about and how do they affect us in society? Social borders, geographical borders, cultural borders, and many other borders as such. And I'd like to try and draw in this debate and say something about what are people looking at, what we call border scholars or border studies today. What are these people looking at? What are they studying? What are the questions? What are the agendas? And what are the open questions which we think are important? And obviously your own feedback will be very interesting in that sense. When I talk about borders to students, not just students, but particularly students, I often set them an exercise. And I show them this caricature. I collect border caricatures. I have quite a collection. I'd be delighted to spend 2 hours here just going through them. But I say to my students, have a look at this caricature, go home, think about it for a few days, and write me an essay about the significance of borders based on this. It says absolutely everything. It's a simple caricature. It's a small piece of desert island, 2 people, and a fence. The question is, of course, does the fence separate them? Yes, it does. Why was the fence set up in the first place between 2 people who barely have room to stand on this desert island? And yet, at the same time, they're meeting across the border. They're shaking hands. They're speaking to each other. So it has everything from why borders or fences are constructed in the first place to what happens when they are constructed. One of the things that happens is that once they're constructed, you always want to see the other side and move beyond it. And normally, not always, normally you want to meet or dialogue with the person on the other side. And so I think it says a great deal about borders, despite the fact that I suppose it's this particular cartoon, in my view, is excellent in its simplicity. I should also add one more point and say that I live and work most of my time in a very troubled, conflictual region, Israel-Palestine. And I live in a community in the south of Israel, which is just 3 miles south of a very real border which has been constructed over the past 5 to 6 years, known as the separation barrier fence wall. And I always say choose whichever term you want to use because I'm not getting involved in a semantic debate about whether it's more fence or more wall or more barrier. It's a border, a very real border. And of course it belies the whole notion that many of us have thought about ever since the destruction of the Berlin Wall, which next month will mark 20 years. I think it was the 9th of November, 20 years ago when the Berlin Wall came down. And at the beginning we had a discourse about the destruction of the Berlin Wall which says this signifies the end of walls and fences and borders in the world, actually 10 years ago this month, when we were celebrating or commemorating 10 years since the end of the Berlin Wall, there were lots of essays, lots of conferences, lots of op-eds. It's a great time, by the way, to be a border scholar at 10, 20, 30 years to the Berlin Wall. You get invited to conferences in lots of interesting places to talk about the topic. But 10 years ago, we tended to sort of present the idea that what had happened, that the destruction, the coming down of the Berlin Wall, had basically signified that the world was moving into a new sort of territorial area. Walls and fences and borders were becoming less relevant, a point I'm going to come back to in a minute, and that really the world was opening up. 10 years down the road, and we're at 20 years, we're not saying that anymore. We're looking at Israel-Palestine. We're looking at the amazing fences and walls that are being built along the USA-Mexico border. We're looking at the whole notion of recreating and reconstructing the real physical borders out there in the name of security, which we may overkill at some point, or we probably are already, but we're reconstructing fences and borders, and of course no one is saying today that 20 years since the Berlin Wall, this was the beginning of the end of the walls and the fences and the borders. And I think it's a discourse which obviously will repeat itself the whole time. I should also say that my perspective on looking at borders is as someone who himself has crossed borders, not just from North to South London for a very short period of time, but certainly within a disciplinary perspective. My background is as a geographer, who 10 years ago set up a Department of Politics and Government, a very interdisciplinary department, I must say, one which practices interdisciplinarity, doesn't just use it as a slogan. We have political scientists and sociologists, historians, geographers. We have a doctor, an architect, and a lawyer. It sounds a bit like the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker. But we have a doctor, an architect, and a lawyer. And so that in itself is a very interesting crossing of borders in its own right. And I often use the crossing of disciplinary borders as a sort of metaphor to try and understand what happens when we cross borders. Because part of the process is the physical crossing. But the physical crossing, in a sense, is a very small part of the overall process of crossing borders altogether. What happens when we get to the other side? Do we feel integrated or don't we feel integrated? Do we feel alienated? Once we cross the other side and find that the grass on the other side is not always greener, sometimes we want to go back across the border in the other direction. So there's a whole dynamics at play here, and it's very interesting actually to use the metaphor of crossing disciplines, because within the academic world as well, we make a great play of saying how important it is to cross disciplinary borders, to understand that the social sciences is a very complex mix of sociology and economics and politics and anthropology and geography and so on. And yet when we meet, we tend to stay with our own semantics and our own language. We find it quite difficult sometimes, I would say, to create some form of hybridity between disciplines. So crossing borders is quite a complex process, sometimes successful and sometimes less so. I should say that within the last 10 or 15 years, or 15 or 20 years, there's been a huge renaissance, both of geopolitics generally, and as a subset of what happens within geopolitics, of the study of borders. This has come about for a number of reasons. I don't wish to bore you with a lecture on the history of the discipline called geopolitics, but just in a few sentences to say that geopolitics, or political geography, to the extent that they are similar in content, is quite an old discipline, going back to the end of the 19th century. There were well-known scholars. Some of my colleagues here, Klaus and Mark, have written about some of these things, some of these people. There were well-known scholars such as the German scholar Friedrich Ratzel or the British scholar Halford Mackinder, who contributed a great deal to what became known as geopolitics. Geopolitics was also taken up by the Third Reich in Germany and Karl Haushofer, And as a result, in the post-World War II era, it was pretty much seen as one of the bad boys of the social sciences. And it was blackballed to a certain extent. You couldn't really teach a great deal under the guise or under the label of political geography or geopolitics in the sort of late 40s, 50s, 60s, and through to the early 70s. But we've moved on in time, and there's been a renaissance of geopolitics, both revisiting traditional geopolitical discourse and also looking at geopolitical change and global change through other eyes. There have been things such as critical geopolitics, other ways of looking at geopolitical change. It's become much more multidisciplinary than in the past, and it has, in a sense, undergone its own renaissance because it's understood that major geopolitical change has taken place in the world in the last 20 and 30 years, not least the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the East-West and the Cold War. And not a great deal had been written in the lead up to that period. And I think to a certain extent it was felt that even looking at it from a traditionalist perspective, there wasn't enough serious thinking and a serious understanding of why geopolitical change happens, when it happens, and where it happens. And I think that was one of the boosts to the return of geopolitics. And there were other reasons, but such as political geography, focusing on other scales of analysis, not just the state and the globe and the world as a whole. Within geopolitics, there have been subsets, one of which is our topic of today, the study of borders. And there's been a tremendous growth in border research in the past, I would say, 15 years. I can testify to the number of conferences, seminars, workshops, books, journals. As a co-editor of Geopolitics, I can testify to the number of papers which are submitted in different themes, of which, without any doubt whatsoever, borders is one of the top 2 or 3 themes around which papers are continually submitted, many of them case studies of different border contexts, but many of them trying to advance our conceptual understanding of what borders are about. And here I have a very short list of some of the things which have happened in recent years. There are networks and organizations of border scholars. Brit is nothing to do with being an ex-colonialist or anything like that. But Brit is a network known as Border Regions in Transition, an international group of scholars, very decentralized, North American and European scholars who meet every 1.5 or 2 years in different interesting border locations to discuss changing concepts and understandings of borders. IBRU is a very well-known institution here in the UK at the University of Durham, the International Boundaries Research Unit, a much more traditionalist perspective on borders and boundaries, but nevertheless has a very important database on the way boundaries are changing. You'll notice I'm interchanging quite freely, and I shouldn't be doing so, between the notions of borders and boundaries. But for the sake of today, I will do so. ABS is a big American organization known as the Association of Borderland Scholars. Until recently, hundreds of people meet every year just to look at the USA-Mexico border from virtually every possible disciplinary perspective that you can imagine, although in recent years they've tended to branch out, and they have a very important journal, the Journal of Borderland Studies, you can see also on that list, which I think is really taking off in recent years as it becomes more global and more conceptual in its perspective. Just a few weeks ago, I was privileged to give the opening address at a conference in Johannesburg of ABORN, which is the African Borders Research Network, a relatively new borders network, but as scholars from throughout Africa looking at the way that boundaries and borders have changed and are constantly changing in Africa, and looking at the relationship between borders and territory, and taking the discourse well beyond the traditional discourse, which simply says, along came the Europeans, they imposed borders on the African continent, they changed the way that people think or do territory in that continent, as a result of which there have been genocides and civil wars in the names of borders, full stop. But now there are a very interesting young group of scholars from throughout Africa who are rethinking notions of territory and borders throughout Africa around this ABORN network. There are cross-border research centers, many of them in Europe, because as the EU has expanded, so borders have come down, and so people have been meeting across borders and discussing ways of cooperation. They've been creating cross-border regions, often promoted by the EU itself. And so you have the CIBC in Ireland, the Nijmegen Border Research Institute in Holland, in the Netherlands. And I'm very involved today in creating, or with some colleagues of mine, a centre, what we want to call the Red Sea Centre for Cross-Border Research, which in its first instances will be based at my university, Ben Gurion University, is in Beersheba, in the south of Israel. We also have a campus in Eilat, which if any of you know anything about, it's because you would go there for winter sun. And it's directly across the border from Jordan, from Aqaba. There are reasonably good relations between Israel and Jordan, and certainly between Eilat and Aqaba, in a region, of course, where most relations between neighboring countries are not so good, and so on. And we're in the process right now of setting up a cross-border research centre between Eilat and Aqaba, and we hope that if and when that gets going for 2 or 3 years, we may even be able to draw in other countries in the region, because actually Eilat and Aqaba sit on the meeting place of 4 borders of Israel, Jordan, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia, is only 10 kilometers south of Aqaba itself. So, and we realize that when you create those things at the very local level, and you tend to stand back a bit from the real big political issues, and you look at issues which affect quality of life, environmental issues, tourism, and so on, which can improve the quality of life of peoples on both sides of the borders, you create a certain form of dialogue, which in itself can lead to other forms of political dialogue and cooperation. It's based around the concept, by the way, that mosquitoes don't require visas. Because I can assure you, I live just 3 miles south of the southern point of the West Bank, or if you live across the Israel-Jordan border in the Jordan Valley or the Arava Valley, you get bitten by the same mosquitoes every night if you don't have cross-border cooperative ventures which can deal with the very serious environmental and ecological issues in that sort of region. You have plenty of border websites, and you just, if you just Google borders, you will see there are all sorts of websites dealing with borders. There are publications, there are journals. In other words, it's become very renaissance. And one of the questions I want to ask and to try and answer is, why should there have been such a renaissance in the interest in and the study of borders? And I want to argue that, ironically, to a certain extent, the Renaissance has come about precisely because around 20 years ago, during the 80s, late 80s, even early 90s, you had a very strong globalization discourse which argued that we are moving into a borderless world, a world without borders, where borders are no longer significant, where they don't play any major role in the political ordering and hierarchizing of society as such. That discourse came about for a number of reasons. One of the reasons was globalization is globalization. And globalization discourse in its purest form argued that there are not any form of boundaries or borders which prevent social and economic and political phenomena from being global rather than state-oriented. And of course, there were all sorts of globalization structural impacts, of which I think the 2 most important to mention are, first of all, the cyberization of society, the internet, and the fact that we all today sit on computers and correspond and communicate with our friends and our colleagues just about everywhere in the world, disseminate almost any type of information we want to disseminate without the possibility of borders or border controls preventing that from happening. And I think there was also a great economics discourse of that period, sort of the global flow of capital in an era of globalization, much better to get rid of as many sort of state tariffs as possible, open the borders, allow a free movement of workers, of capital, and so on. And from those 2 sources came the notion that the world is becoming borderless, borders are becoming insignificant, and there was another term thrown into the argument: the world is becoming deterritorialized. Territory or space or geography, or whatever term you want to use, is no longer a major player, a significant player in the world, in the way that we organize society. I've always argued in what I've written that there is no such thing as deterritorialization, that there is only re-territorialization, that the world is continually undergoing a process of re-territorialization. It happens in the physical sense whenever there are wars after the First World War, the Second World War, when borders come tumbling down after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and to a certain extent globalization has added a structural dynamic to the way that we think about territory. Possibly today the territories that are more important to us are not necessarily state territories, yet they are nevertheless important territories in the way that countries do international relations and countries play global geopolitical power. But of course our local territories are in a sense the municipalities, the cities, the regions within which we live are also the forms of spatial or territorial compartment, all of which have borders by definition, which are very important in the way that we undergo our daily life practices, where we pay taxes, where we go to school, where our hospital regions are, and so on. It's very hard for me to think of a world in which some form of territorial hierarchy and some form of territorial compartmentalization does not exist. That is constantly undergoing change. It is re-territorializing constantly, but in my view, there is no such thing as the total deterritorialization or the total borderlessness of the world. There cannot be such a thing. I would also add and say that the borderless world also came not just from the globalization discourse, but also, of course, from what was happening in Western Europe. The expansion of the EU, the move from 6 to 9 to 15 to more countries, accompanied each time by the opening of borders, the removal of borders, which in the past were between states, the freedom of movement between countries which just 50 or 60 years ago were the worst possible enemies, and in the name of which wars and violence were being perpetrated. It is actually quite amazing whether you are a supporter of Europe or a critic of Europe or both of them. Nevertheless, none of us can stand back and say it is not amazing the extent to which, with all of its hang-ups, Europe has territorially, or Western Europe at least, has become to a certain extent an open space, an open territory over the past 50 years. One of the most interesting articles or papers I've read about borders in recent years was actually published in the Journal of Tourism Research. And basically what it argued was that governments in Western Europe should prevent those last bits of wall and fence from being knocked down, if only because they are fantastic for attracting tourists from Japan and North America, and around which you can build up commercialism, tourism, slogans, I cross the border, and so on, and keep those last bits of fences and borders as a great tourist attraction. I often say to my colleagues in Israel, I'm waiting for the day when, the only significance of borders in Israel and Palestine is the tourism element. Unfortunately, we've got to construct them before we start removing them in our region. Constructing them, obviously, on a bilateral and agreed-upon basis, not upon a unilateral and an imposed basis, as the separation barrier is. But nevertheless, it would be very nice to think of so many regions in the world where the only significance of borders, was some sort of historical tourism. And it also, of course, remained for another one of our colleagues, a very good friend of ours from the United States, Professor Alex Murphy, to remind me once. He reminded me, he said, David, you've strayed too far from geography. You've forgotten what we always teach our students in the very first class in human geography when we try to tell them what is geography. And we tell them that geography is about spatial differentiation, why things happen in one place and they don't happen in another place. And of course, when we talk about the changes in borders, we should be very conscious of the fact that borders are being removed, have been removed in some regions. In other regions, they remain as they were. And in other regions, because of political realities, they are being constructed. And that changes in time, it changes in space, it changes in place. And I think it also says something about the impact or the relative influence of the Western discourse on territory and borders, and I would say even more than that, the Western European discourse, much more than the North American discourse to a certain extent, because it was happening in Western Europe more than in any other place in the world. So borders are coming down in some places and they're going up in other places, but at the same time we should be aware it has changed. Globalization has changed the way we relate to space and territory and borders. Certainly the type of audience that are sitting in this room, we tend to travel a great deal, we tend to cross borders much more easily, perhaps many of us have more than one citizenship, we are all internet and cyber networked and linked up. We quite easily forget there are regions in the world which still have not used their first computers, and many of which maybe still haven't got round to mobile telephones as such, and therefore they are still much more focused and centered on very small areas and pieces of territory. They don't move about in the same way that we do. So of course the notion of borderlessness is contingent upon who we are and where we are and what groups we belong to. But there's been another discourse. Parallel to the discourse of borderless worlds, there's been another discourse. I'm just showing the occasional caricatures. There's been another discourse which has particularly hit us in a big way in the past 10 years, I would say particularly in the post-9/11 era. And that's been a discourse of securitization. 9/11 and then what happened in London a few years later and in Madrid has brought into our public debate the notion of global terrorism. Now, coming from where I come from, I would be the last person to be naive about the threat of violence in both directions, obviously, and the threat of terrorism and when it does occur. But it seems to me that the use or the manipulation, to a certain extent, of the securitization discourse has enabled some groups within societies to come back in a big way to counter the notion of borderless worlds. A year and a half ago, I was present at a conference on borders, which took place in Las Cruces, the University of Las Cruces in New Mexico, where we were discussing the USA-Mexico border and differences in borders. And it was a meeting of academic scholars and practitioners who deal with the USA-Mexico border. And we had one very interesting presentation from a senior member of the Department of Homeland Security who came down especially from Washington. And I can more or less quote him verbatim, not the accent, and I may get some of the words wrong, but what he more or less said to us was, he says, you guys don't understand what borders are about. He says, we in the Department of Homeland Security believe that every one of 1 million Mexicans crossing in and out of the United States on a weekly basis is a potential terrorist unless proven otherwise. The fact that, of course, no Mexican has ever been arrested or suspected for any form of cross-border terrorist activity is an irrelevance. And the fact that today the Department of Homeland Security are creating fences and walls along great parts of the USA-Mexico border in order to meet other economic and political objectives, such as preventing illegal immigrants from crossing the border to seek cheaper work, preventing smuggling, and so on. In other words, they have a justification for taking stronger measures, which may or may not be justified, but taking much stronger measures. But in the name of securitization, you can do a lot of things in society which you cannot do in the name of many other discourses and so on. There's even been an amazing growth. There's a movement along the USA-Mexico border called the Minutemen. The Minutemen are sort of private militias in Texas and other borderland states who basically patrol parts of the border. The government aren't really greatly keen on them. Not even the Bush government was tremendously keen on them. And they actually have a website. If I had time, I'd show it here, but I don't have the time. You can Google it, look up Minutemen, or look up on the Google a site called Adopt a Border, Adopt a Post. They have a website which says, well, you know, if you want to contribute towards American security in an era of global terrorism, what you should do is you should adopt a border post, like you adopt a highway. You pay $200, and you will have funded the next 10 meters of border fence, and you can dedicate that border post to a departed person or to whoever or whatever you want. There are pictures of the border posts there, some of which are dedicated towards pets who have died and they're buried at that spot. But there are also a number of border posts which have been, repeat themselves, in the name of whoever killed by an illegal alien. And this is a discourse which is going on. I'm not passing any judgment on it at the moment, but this is a discourse which has come back in a big way. The idea that 20 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we are building fences and we are building walls in the name of a discourse which we thought had disappeared from the world is, I think, very significant. Now, when we come to look at borders generally, we have these two parallel discourses. We have the discourse of borderless worlds, globalization, the opening of borders, and we have this discourse of securitization, creating and constructing new borders. And what has happened, if you read a lot of the literature on borders of the past 10 years, is that they tend to be presented in a very polar or binary perspective. Either you're a believer in the borderless world discourse, I know I'm making this very simplistic, but still, or you're a believer in the securitization discourse. In other words, the question is, or let me put it in the words of a colleague of mine from the Association of Borderland Scholars. She said, Iracema Coronado from the University of Texas in El Paso, she said, you know, if we wanted funding for research in the 1990s on border-related research, we would go to NAFTA or NAFTA-related organizations, and the question they wanted answered was, how do you make borders easier to cross? If we want funding today for border-related research, we have to go to the Department of Homeland Security, and they want us to tell them, how do you make borders more difficult to cross? And I think that one of the challenges facing border scholars today is not so much as looking at one of these polar perspectives on borders, but in trying to understand how do these two narratives, these two understandings of what is happening at borders, how do they operate in the same time and space at one and the same time? Because it is not an either-or situation. Within the United States today, within Europe today, there are those who on the one hand say, for the reasons of security, for the reasons of preventing illegal immigration, for the reasons of preventing smuggling, we have to think of how we control our borders more stringently. And at one and the same time, there are lobbyists who say, in the name of globalization, in the name of economics, there has not been, I'm glad to say, a return to protectionism because of the recent recession. There are those who say, but we have to also keep borders as flexible as possible. People move freely. They live in one country and they work across the border. They live in the south of Holland and they work in Belgium. They live in Copenhagen and they cross the bridge every day to work in Malmo. And we need to keep these borders open because that's what's happening in society today. And I think one of the big challenges on the agenda of border studies for the next few years is to try and bring these two parallel discourses in together with each other, because that is the real dynamics of what's happening at borders today. Both things are happening at one and the same time. In certain places, one is stronger than the other. In countries in conflict with their neighbours, so the closing border discourse is much stronger. In places like Western Europe, the opening border discourse is much stronger, but neither operate in a vacuum. They don't operate just on them by their own, and it is important to try and see how we bring these things together. What is on the agenda of border studies? And I think there are many issues. Some of this list, I mean, you've seen already, I've discussed already in the past few minutes. But I think what interests me greatly, and what I would say categorizes many of these other themes, is the nature of power relations as they relate to borders. At the end of the day, borders are social constructions. We create them. People create borders. Governments create borders. Armies create borders when they win or lose wars, or when they sign peace agreements or surrender agreements. Yes, we often use natural features in the landscape because that is convenient, But nature of its own does not create the social or the human boundary. We create the borders and we change them as and when political and historical contingency determines as such. So there are a whole range of questions related to the nature of power relations, such as who creates the border, and in whose name and for what purpose. And how do they, if I can use a geographical term, how do they demarcate and delineate borders? But that's not just a geographical concept, because when a politician or a government office decides that you belong to social category A and not to B, or to economic class C and not to D, you have in essence demarcated a border. You have determined the conditions which determine which side of that border, in which category, in which compartment you are in. And the ability to cross the border from one side to the other, from one country to another, from one social group to another, from one religion to another, one of the most difficult borders to cross. You need a lot more than a visa to get across that sort of border. Then, these are questions of power relations. How are borders managed? There's a whole notion today of borders as institutions. Yes, borders are institutions because they are brought into being by people. They are perpetuated. Pardon me. They are perpetuated by people. They are managed by people who have an interest in having borders, because it serves various political and social and economic interests. And I think one of the things we also have to understand is it's not necessarily different groups in power who either want borders to be created or destroy them. Often it can be the same groups whose particular power or economic interests have changed over time. It's not as though the move to the move in NAFTA or in Western Europe over a period of time to the deconstruction of borders, the reduction of tariffs and so on, it's not as though one economic group was displaced by another economic group. It's the same economic and power elites, it's just that the particular political and economic interests have changed over time, and they then have an interest in not having borders where once they had an interest in having borders and so on. And I think a lot of this falls under the categorization of power relations. Who, for what purpose, how are they managed, how are they institutionalized, and so on. There are other themes, and I don't have time to talk about them, but the whole notion of borderlands, what happens in and around borders. There are different terms used in different disciplines: borderlands, border zones, frontiers, transition spaces, and so on. And I think very interesting questions are raised when people do meet across the border. What happens at the meeting place? Does the line disappear and a transition zone appear in its place? The EU, as it moved into every stage of expansion, put a great deal of funding into creating cross-border regions, social, cultural, economic regions, so that people would meet and interact across the border before the border finally disappeared, so they would get to know each other, get to trust each other, get to understand that what's on the other side of the border is not as threatening as they first thought, and actually they're quite the same type of people with the same sort of economic and social and domestic problems and so on. And the question is, do you create some sort of hybridity where people with different languages and different customs come together and mix together, or does the difference maintain itself despite the crossing of borders? What happens in these transition zones and borderlands as borders are opened and people meet each other? I think one of the fascinating things that I found in listening to many border scholars looking at cross-border zones in Europe is the fact that if we go to a border seminar or conference today, there will always be young scholars presenting a new border case study. Europe has expanded into another 3 countries. Oh, there are another 10 cross-border regions to examine. For border scholars, it's great because when we go to border conferences, the obligatory field trip is to cross the border. And you take pictures and you laugh about it because you've done it so many times. But the truth is the experience is pretty much the same time after time after time. But nevertheless, we can tick it off and say we've crossed this border now, that sort of thing. But what is very interesting, and I've thought about this a great deal recently, is that people come to show how borders have opened in Europe by saying, well, you know what? We live in Holland, but we send our kids to study in Belgium every day. Why? Because Belgium schools are more disciplinarian than the ones in Holland. We live in Spain, but we cross into a restaurant in France once a week, once every 2 weeks, because we want a better meal, or something like that. So they're trying to show that borders have opened, but in fact what they are doing, in essence, is saying we are crossing the non-existent border because there really is difference on both sides. Now, whether over time that difference merges into each other and there's some sort of transition, or whether difference is maintained. So in a sense, it strengthens the notion of difference by talking about it the whole time. It's not a bad or a good thing. There's no subjective judgment about this. But it's very interesting that we like to think that when we discuss the cross-border experience, we are intimating that the world is, that the region is becoming more uniform. And in essence, by describing the crossing of the border, we are focusing on the fact that we cross it because we are interested in the difference that exists on the other side. I'm always reminded by a colleague of mine in Ireland who tells me that until a few years ago, of course, the physical border between the north and the south was opened some years ago, and you drive quite freely through, but you're very well aware that you do it because although the Republic underwent much greater development in the north, nevertheless the roads in the north are still better than the ones in the south. But at the same time, people who have lived in villages which were traditionally cut into two by the North-South Irish border told me until a few years ago what used to happen was, well, if you wanted still to go and drink in a pub where smoking was allowed, you walked up the road to the pub which was on the northern side of the border because the Republic of Ireland was the first country to bring in the legislation banning smoking in the pubs. But then if you wanted to continue drinking all night, before they extended opening laws in the UK, you then walked back down the street to the south of the border because you could continue for far longer in that. So here was an example where because the border was open, movement was free, but you emphasized difference. I realize that's, maybe a bit whimsical, it may be a bit superficial, but I think it says a lot about the notion of crossing borders. And there's a last theme here, which a colleague of ours in Nijmegen, Henk van Houten, I think has been trying to focus on. I think it's a very important topic. It comes back to power relations. The question of, what is the ethics of bordering? What do we do at borders? How do we treat people at borders when they cross? And do we treat them in a humane way, in an ethical way? And what is the whole ethics of the bordering process? I'd like to end with an anecdote. And the anecdote is one which was told at a conference that I organized in Israel some years ago of geopolitics scholars. The rector of my university, the past rector of my university, Professor Nachum Finger, who was an engineer, he called me the night before and he said, David, I understand you've got, he was invited to say something at the opening dinner, and he was very good. He tried to find out what the conferences were about and say something significant and relevant. And he called me and I told him it's about borders and geopolitics, and he came and he told the following story. He says, look, my parents, like many post-Holocaust Jewish survivors and so on, came to Israel or Palestine after the Second World War. My grandfather often told me, he said, my grandfather grew up in the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century. I can't remember the exact countries he used as the example, Central Eastern Europe. He said, you know what? He said, when I was a young kid, I lived in country A. And when I was a student, I was in country B. And all my working life, I lived in country C. And when I retired, I went back to country D. And Professor Finger said, I used to ask my grandfather, he says, how is it possible that in Eastern Europe, early 20th century, pre-mobility, pre-technology, no asphalt roads, you moved around so much? And my grandfather said to me, move around? I never left the house I was born on. Just every 20 years, they kept shifting the borders around me. I think that says a great deal, first of all, for the relationship of borders and identity, but I think it says a great deal about the social construction of borders. At the end of the day, We create borders, we construct them, and we deconstruct them. They are a very central part. We live in a society, in a world, which is categorized, which is compartmentalized territorially, socially, culturally, and therefore it is behoven upon us to try and understand the dynamics and the way in which borders are changing. Thank you.